This podcast feels unfamiliar, bigger somehow. It's all that's left of our bad takes. What podcast is this? Well, it's America's moldiest podcast, The Pod People. I'm Matisse Van Rossum, and I wish I knew what day it was.
I'm Ben Sheets, and this podcast seems so unfamiliar.
I just said that.
Well, unfortunately, I also have one that you just said, and my name is Cleveland Mosier, and I'm getting moldier and oldier.
And we are very excited today to be joined by a special guest. We're joined by Ted Hentschke, who is the head of production for DreadX and the editor-in-chief for DreadXP. Ted, thank you so much for joining us.
Yo, what's up, guys? I didn't know I should have a tagline when I came here, so I didn't prepare one, so I'm just going to say hello.
Oh, you're good. No worries, man. So before we get started with our film for the week, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, tell the listeners what you do, and sort of your background and relationship with horror as a genre.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm currently the head of productions for DreadX, which is the game production wing of the Dread label, which is a horror indie production label. We put out about 20 movies a year. We recently came out with Butt Boy and Sea Fever is another one of ours. Torpedo is another one of ours that recently came out. We're coming out with Uncle Peckerhead recently. We recently did the re-release of Circus of the Dead. So, you know, we put out a lot of movies, and I do the game stuff. I'm largely in charge of the production for the DreadX collection and a bunch of other cool stuff that, you know, we haven't announced yet. So my connection with horror is that I was a horror journalist for almost 8 years now. Jesus. And, started off in film, moved more into games as time went on. And honestly, I'm really looking forward to being able to just sit down and chat about movies again, because that used to be my favorite part of the film journalism side of things. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's our favorite part, too, and we're really happy to have you. What kind of horror films do you usually go for? What are some of your favorites, subgenre or specific or otherwise?
When it comes to horror, my personal taste is more towards like ghost stories, supernatural stories, things like that. I'm not a huge slasher movie fan, not as much as probably your average horror fan, but I actually started as the found footage guy for Dread Central. Like that's what I did for my first horror gig, and this is when I was like 20. So a lot of that supernatural stuff is really, really close to my heart. All those ghost films, the things that go bump in the night. I love all that kind of stuff. So I would say that's my biggest affinity is for those kind of unique ghost stories. And I will say that I really have enjoyed the past few years, the trend of what people will call elevated horror. I mean, I don't really believe in the genre categorizations of like elevated versus non-elevated horror. I just think that that's kind of the direction the genre is going in for kind of headier horror. And I'm all about it. So, and luckily this is one of those movies that I think pretty much everyone would agree is elevated horror. So there's plenty to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into introducing the film we're talking about. We are talking about the brand new 2020 Australian film Relic, which is directed by Natalie Erica James and stars Emily Mortimer, Robin Nevin, and Bella Heathcote, and is the story of a daughter, mother, and grandmother who are haunted by the manifestation of dementia that consumes their family home. I had this one on my radar a little bit. I had heard some good things, but Ted actually recommended that we talk about this one for the podcast because you saw it recently and got pretty excited about it. So I'd love it if we could start out with just some of your initial thoughts on this, Ted, to sort of lead us in.
Yeah, I didn't really realize that when I was kind of ranting about this movie that it would lead to a podcast discussion. Relic is one of those movies that you come across once in a blue moon that, for me, this movie hit in a way that most films don't in terms of what the terror was, the terrors of dementia, et cetera. Because I'm not someone that really believes in supernatural possessions. I don't believe that I'm a pretty big dude, so like that's the thing that like always kind of like didn't really ring to me about slashers is that like I'm a pretty big dude. I work out a lot, so like I'm not saying that I could take any slasher killer in a fight, but it's just like not an active fear that I have that someone's gonna like break into my house. Because I used to be a bouncer and shit. Like it's just like
me
that
too.
kind of like that kind of stuff just doesn't really like scare me, I guess, because I feel like I could like get a relative grip on the situation. But like as soon as like a demon starts crawling out of a TV, like that's when I know I'm fucked. So it's like the things that I can't overcome with my physical body, and one of those things is like mental decay and decline, and it's always been something that I've been afraid. Well, I wouldn't say always. I was like 4 once. I didn't even know what it was, but like it's something that I've been afraid of for quite a long time. Is like the declining mental health of age, because I think it's it's really tragic. So when I watched this film, it struck me on a level that most horror films don't, and that was the first kind of the big powerful moment. But the other thing is that it's really, really rare to find a horror art film. There are plenty of horror art films out there where the monster is a metaphor, but it's pretty rare to find a horror art film that plays the horror elements straight. Generally, you'll find that with artsy indie horror, the metaphor becomes too either on the nose, or it becomes so about focusing on the metaphor that they forget that this also has to be like a scary movie.
Yeah,
and
I will say
really
nebulous. It gets kind of lost in the fog.
Well, it kind of it drowns itself in its own ejaculate. Is most indie horror films is like you have this it's so deep and it's so emotive, and then it's just like nothing really happens. So when we see certain films like It Follows or The Babadook that manage to not only have this message that's clear, it's not something you have to read into too much. It's also like a damn fine horror movie. Those are the movies I kind of really like. There was a film that came out, I want to say 5-6 years ago. No, it must have been 4. I'm trying to judge it based on like failed relationships, and I was like, who was I dating when I saw that movie?
Oh yeah, I feel
So
that.
this is probably about 4 years ago. A movie called Monster. I don't know if you've seen Monster.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's another.
There's a couple of movies named Monster. Which one?
The one with the mother and the daughter that get attacked by a monster in a car.
Oh, okay.
And
No,
it's
I
about
actually have not seen that one.
That's another kind of elevated horror film, but that one's a little bit more on the nose because it's about a mother and daughter that get attacked by a monster in a car, and then a lot of the relationship between the mother and the daughter comes to the forefront with the neglect and kind of like abuse and stuff. And then there's also a monster trying to break in. And I always like those kinds of movies that have that supernatural element that you can point to and say, like, there's something going on, and it isn't just I'm trying to think of a good counterexample, but I should have come slightly more prepared for this. But I watch a shit ton of bad horror movies, like just like a truly unconscionable amount. Like it should be like basically over the past 8 years, I've probably watched 2 horror movies a day on average.
Right on. Love that.
Oh, there we go. The Midnight Ghost Swim, I think, is what it's called. The Midnight Swim? What was it? I'm looking it up. Night Swim. It was a recent movie I watched. Yeah, The Midnight Swim was a recent found footage horror, I think, movie I watched, and that one is like one of those where the entire movie is about just like wanking. Like it's just about like look how long my shots are, look how emotive it is. It's just like, and I hated it. Like I really like I don't use that word often because I don't like to shit on creators, but like that's an example of a film that is just entirely lost in its own metaphor.
Pretentious is I think the word.
I think that's such an interesting place to start because I think while I mostly agree with you, and I think this movie in particular kind of dodges some of those bullets of I like to call the subgenre almost A24 horror.
Yeah.
You know, movies inspired by like Hereditary or The Witch, where it's all about atmosphere and slow burns and metaphor. Honestly, though, I might push back a little bit on this one because I think my biggest criticism with it is it's a bit slow in the first half. I was hoping for a bit more. I think it focused so much on the family drama that it kind of lost some opportunities for some good horror moments.
Interesting. I enjoy. I mean, I notoriously on the podcast love a slow burn, so I definitely didn't feel anything there. And I like having an opportunity to get to know the protagonists well enough, so I'm concerned for them when the horror occurs.
Yeah, you know, I'm really glad, Ted, that you brought up It Follows, because I was thinking about that movie in reference to this film a lot myself. I enjoyed this film quite a bit, and I think that in terms of its execution, it does everything like extremely well. The pace doesn't bother me. I didn't think it was too slow, but I actually think that maybe one of my major criticisms with this is I think that its metaphor is maybe a little bit too on the nose, and I think that sometimes it kind of forgets that it's supposed to be like a horror narrative. Like I felt the whole time that like it never felt like the house was actually haunted. It's like every time we see this kind of like weird specter, it's like, oh, it's literally just the degradation of the grandmother's like mental state. And I think that as a metaphor, it's extremely powerful, and the way that it's visually represented is extremely successful, but it never felt like anything more than its metaphor to me. Whereas something like It Follows is, at its complete surface level, a straight up monster movie. But it is representative of many other things, the trauma caused by sexual violence, so on and so forth, and the way that follows people for their whole lives. And I wanted this movie to bridge that gap just a little bit more. I wanted it to feel more like a ghost story.
I would say it almost pulls too many punches in the first half. You know, you get moments of, you know, for example, the cabin, which I think are great.
The dream sequences.
The dream sequence of the cabin and the decayed old man, I think are fantastic, but they work as grotesque set pieces and less scary scenes in themselves because they're so verite and kind of on their own in dream sequences. They're kind of separated from everything else. I kind of wish things were integrated a little bit more overall.
Interesting. Yeah, I was hit pretty hard by those sequences, especially because like the production value is so effective and rich with detail.
Yeah, like I said, they're great, but they kind of feel a little disparate.
I have a fun way to kind of tie in all three of these points. Ted, you mentioned the Babadook earlier, and
yes, you did.
I think funny enough, like also being an Australian horror film, it's probably our best comparison because like it also structurally they're very similar, and the reveal that the horror is a metaphor comes at the end in a similar fashion. I think that said, I think one of the strengths of the Babadook is the Babadook. Like it has a very strong character in of itself. Like it has a very strong personality with its book. It has the whole rhyme built around it. Like it is a monster first and foremost in the film, and you have that sustenance of just wondering about it. So when the metaphor comes around, it's an additional element. Here, I do wonder, like, if at the beginning, I think one of Ben's gripes could also be tied into the fact that like the personality of the house is a haunted house. And that's essentially what we have to go off of. For me, that was enough. Like I was wondering the whole time, like what was behind the house. And the mystery of it was enough, and not having an identifier like the Babadook was okay for me. But I can see that gripe. Like I can see how you would want something a little bit more there. But the production value was enough for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, a good example is like we see a lot in the first half of this kind of like looming specter of dementia, this sort of like Slender Man-esque, like spooky creature that kind of like lurks in the background of shots. The problem for me where it became disjointed is that I never felt like that represented a danger for anybody other than the grandmother, who was obviously like losing her mind, like losing her memories and stuff. You know, a scene that I think is executed as a horror set piece very well is like when the grandmother comes back and she asks like Emily Mortimer to check under the bed. She says it's here, it's under the bed. And we get this really creepy scene of like Emily Mortimer like going under the bed and like staring into the darkness for a really long time and seeing something kind of like move. But I never felt like that represented a threat to her. You know what I mean? It's like, this is obviously the degradation of one of these characters represented physically, but it didn't feel like a monster to me, or a ghost or whatever. It just, I had a hard time seeing past the metaphor.
I felt pretty strapped in only by personal proxy. I, grew up with the only memories I really have of my grandfather, who was really well loved by my family, was him when he was already like well into the latter stages of Alzheimer's. And so my memory of him is always that, like growing up. And I was only ever able to hear the stories of the man he was. But all I ever saw and experienced of him was the end.
Yeah.
That can really change your perspective. And growing up around that sort of dementia, like, and the stories around that, like, have definitely like haunted me in a very personal and specific way. And I felt like this film keyed into a lot of those things. And I've been witnessing similar things in one of my like current grandparents as well. And so those little key moments that weren't even built around classic horror, but more personal moments, like the ring, where the grandmother gives Sam the ring,
Yeah.
and then later on she sees it on her and accuses her of stealing it. Those things were very personal for me. Like I really keyed into those moments, and it affected me like almost more than the spooky monster under the bed.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like I should clarify, like, this gripe that I have is pretty much a nitpick, because I like the way this movie handles things, and I think that as a portrait of like a family dealing with the steady mental decline of one of their loved ones and seeing the way that affects them hereditarily as well, I think it's a masterclass. It's one of the best depictions of that I've ever seen. So like when I say that I don't think like the horror aspects extend much beyond the metaphor, it's like they don't necessarily have to.
Yeah.
I think that's a way that if it did do more with that, it would be higher elevated. But I think for what it is, it's quite successful. So I just want to clarify that, because I think that the scene where she forgets that she's given her granddaughter the ring is a very effective and tragic scene. Like, ooh boy, this movie is a downer. It is. Yeah. Go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
Yeah. One of the things that we often like run into when talking about horror, or in films in general, any kinds of criticism, is the difference between intention and personal preference. Mm-hmm. So there's this. And this is something that's a little bit hard for a lot of critics to wrap their heads around. And it's something you always have to keep in mind, which is that like there are certain things that like you're just not going to like as much because you don't like them as much, or you're not going to find as scary. That's one of the reasons that I really hate this whole term that's often used in the horror sphere by the most gatekeepy of gatekeepers, where they're saying like, well, I just didn't think it was scary. Like it just wasn't scary. And I always hate that, because like there's things that you can criticize about a film or a game or whatever beyond like, well, I just didn't think like I just didn't think it was scary argument. It's like someone dropping the Bible in front of you and being like, well, I believe this, so you're done. And it's like there's no discussion to be had at that point, because like you can criticize the empirical elements of a thing, but as soon as you just go, well, these are my feelings, you're like, okay, well, what am I going to say? And it's not that I think that people can't feel a certain way. It's like, there's definitely merit to what you're saying with like, this is what I prefer, but there's personal preference, and then there's the intentionality of the filmmaker. And the intentionality of the filmmaker is like, so when you're talking about that slow burn at the beginning and that like the time that it goes to, there's no doubt that was what the director intended, like whether or not that resonated with you is a different question. A lot of times when we're criticizing bad movies, it's because the director tried to do a thing and failed. And I would say that nothing about The Relic, or sorry, this film is just called Relic, by the way. Yeah. The Relic is like a 1997 monster flick. But nothing about Relic feels unintentional,
Oh yeah,
I agree.
everything feels
Yeah.
by design. This film
Wholeheartedly.
is quite meticulous.
Well,
This is like, we should mention, like, this is the, as far as I know, the debut feature of this director. She's very young. She's done some shorts and stuff.
I saw some
But,
credits attached to Upgrade of all things. Let me see.
Yeah, I think she was
Interesting.
like Lee Whannell's assistant or something on that.
Yeah,
I looked
IMDb
at that.
just says miscellaneous.
But yeah, this is like her debut feature film. She's quite young, and I think that she's definitely somebody that I want to watch further, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, Ted. Like, everything in this film feels very meticulously intentional. I also love that you bring up the people being like, oh, it's not good because it's not scary. We've never talked about that on this show before, but a really good example is like maybe a week ago or two, I had a friend who posted on like both Twitter and Facebook, like, finally got around to seeing Hereditary. It's a great movie, but not scary at all. I don't know why anybody says this movie is scary. It's like, okay, but you started out by saying it's a great movie. Like, why do you feel the need to attach that you didn't find it scary? Horror encompasses fear, but horror is much more than just fear.
Yeah.
And that's the weird thing about the horror genre, is that unlike other genres, well, I guess if you get deep enough into any genre, there's an element of this, but like a big part of horror is like swinging the biggest dick.
Yeah.
Like that's just like the culture is like, well, I'm not scared by anything. And it's like, oh, aren't you so cool? You're such a badass. And like, I get this all the time where people are like, I bet nothing scares you anymore because you've seen all these movies. And I'm like, no, I get scared like pretty easily. That's why I like horror. I'm like actually pretty easily frightened, even though I watch so many movies, and that's why I watch them, because I find that enjoyable. And all these people that go around saying like, not scary all the time, I'm like, do you have any fun doing anything?
Right.
Like, or are you
point.
just, yeah. And I don't know. I always find it to be, it's like the weirdest of flexes to me. It's like, people are like, I watched this thing and I appreciate the qualities, but I didn't enjoy it. It's like, really? Are you just gonna go out in public and like publicly declare that you enjoy nothing? Like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, do you think that then once you have declared that all the movies don't scare you, you are then crowned king badass and everyone legally has to suck your dick?
Right,
It's
like you're
is
the
that what you think
bravest.
Ed Bull is?
You're the bravest motherfucker on the planet.
You're the coolest guy. Like, whatever.
And,
you know?
and like, to attach that to something else that you think is good too, like to use that as a qualifier, it's like, it's good, but it's not scary. It's who fucking cares?
Yeah, if it's good,
Like,
it's good.
I'm the type of person that like horror movies don't particularly like frighten me, because I've become somewhat like disconnected from just like watching so much of it, but they can still be impactful and have lasting effects. Like, I'm not worried about having nightmares when I go to sleep after watching a horror movie, but that doesn't mean that it can't still like really resonate with me on like a deep level, you know? Like, there's enough
Oh, yeah, most
scary
definitely.
there's enough scary shit in real life for me to be afraid of. Like, there's enough I have enough things that I'm afraid of in the real world. It's like, okay, so if a movie doesn't like make me fucking piss my pants or whatever, that doesn't mean it's not a good movie.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, like, yeah, it can be so detrimental and limiting to the genre, like to just equate like horror film need to scare me or bad. Yeah, there are so many more emotions to feel.
Well, I think you make a good point about the intent of the first half. The one thing I am not 100% sure of is the effectiveness in terms of the movie, especially with regards to how much it escalates in the second half with getting lost in the Silent Hill house section, essentially, because it really goes from 1 to 100 there. And I
love that sequence.
You know, I would wonder if, you know, it's definitely my favorite section of the movie, and I wonder if sprinkling more elements of that may have worked better. I would almost compare this movie in some respects to something like Jacob's Ladder.
Right.
Oh yeah, okay.
You know, it's that same kind of psychological horror about mental instability. But what Jacob's Ladder does is, you know, it sprinkles that in throughout the movie and it escalates throughout the movie. Whereas this movie, I feel like once we get to the Silent Hill house, I'll tub it. It really escalates things where the rest of the movie wasn't quite there before.
Now, when you're talking about Jacob's Ladder, you're of course talking about the 1990 original,
Yes,
not the
of
2019 remake.
course.
Of course, yes.
Which we have also covered on the podcast.
I do believe I'm the only person that has seen the 2019 remake.
I think you
It's
might
on
be.
Netflix.
The one person.
We covered the 1991 several months ago, and I think in that episode I think we might have talked about the trailer for the new one and how it looked just like absolutely unappealing to us in every way. Was it?
Yeah,
was,
that's
was it as
one
bad
of
as it
those
looks?
films that where you can, like, if we were going to criticize a filmmaker for making something bland and slow and uninteresting, it's like that's the 2019 Jacob's Ladder to a T. I mean, it's the same plot, but instead of it being like the original, which is that he dies in, well, actually, I do think it's even that he dies in war. But he's like, there's like this subplot about crack addiction and how he's actually his brother or something like that. It's not a very good movie. Yeah, it's very silly. I completely forgot what we were talking about because now I'm remembering Jacob Ladder.
We were talking kind of about the escalation.
Yes.
With the turn.
Yeah. And I do know what you're talking about though with Relic, which is like, she goes and she finds these notes, and all of a sudden it's a horror movie, like a more traditional horror movie. Now it's a haunted house movie. Yeah, and there's basically that moment where she finds the kind of the secret area, and then it becomes a monster movie. Yeah.
The Silent Hill House Haunting of Leaves. No, wait, hold on. I had something better. It's sorry. I'm combining three things. Hold on. It's the Silent Hill House of Leaves. That was it.
There you go.
Yeah. The Silent Hill House of Leaves.
That's good. I like that.
Yeah.
I definitely saw the parallels between this and House of Leaves.
Directly out of the book, some sequences.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Like the one where the walls are closing in reminded me so much of the sequence where the text starts closing in and Navidson is like crawling through the space as it becomes progressively smaller. I was very happy to see that. That is by no means a critique. That's a point of praise for me because I love that book and I've wanted to see it adapted for quite a long time. So seeing anything that comes close to it that pays such wonderful homage was quite nice.
Yeah,
I don't think you can adapt that book.
I was just gonna say the same thing. I liked to see some of those ideas expressed in this movie, something that's totally separate. I would hate to see anybody try to adapt House of Leaves because so much of what makes the book effective is reading the physical book and like the way that like it plays with form. I cannot imagine that as a film that does the book justice.
You know what? You're totally right. And when I say that, I specifically mean the Navidson Record documentary.
Well, and what I'm saying is that like if they were to make House of Leaves a movie, then it would have to like call your phone and give you sub narrations over the phone while the movie plays.
Right, you gotta have
like
the footnotes.
It would have to do something really weird. I mean, like you can't just make. I mean, even if you're just making a video recreation of the Navidson record, like you'd have to have those layers to it because that's what makes House of Leaves so meaty. Because like the actual story of House of Leaves is kind of like, there's a guy and he moves into a house and his wife doesn't like him very much and then the walls are spooky. But like the writing style and like the is what makes it like so uniquely compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I agree wholeheartedly. Let's talk about the house in this movie. Because we have in the past talked about locations as characters, classically in something like The Shining. I think this movie does that extremely well. And another reason that I kind of think like the, we'll call it ghost for lack of a better term, I think almost distracts from the house as like the true monster of this film, because it is, a direct representation of the grandmother's mind. It's moldering, it's falling apart, and as we find in the third act, it contains sort of like a house within it. The granddaughter finds this passageway that leads to this sort of like labyrinthine
endless
hallways that lead nowhere, and just like we see more of that degradation. And And this is once again, this comes down to personal taste. I would have loved to start getting into that stuff a little bit sooner.
You wanted more of it.
I would have, rather than having like the spooky ghost like sort of looming in some parts in the early acts, I would have rather started to introduce the idea of like the house as sort of like a shifting maze a little bit more. I would have liked to see more of that earlier, I think.
I actually felt it was well foreshadowed personally. The sequence where Sam is going down the staircase. I love how that's edited.
It's
so good. And the mother sort of appearing, them hearing the knocks in the walls, the neighbor being trapped in the room and not knowing why, I think was just enough information for that to feel like an epiphany in that moment when it is revealed to be an endless hallway.
Narratively, a lot of that stuff works well, and I think the backstory of the cabin and the stained glass window really adds to it a little bit more. The one thing I wish they would have elaborated on is kind of spatial awareness of the house as it is normally. I don't know if I could necessarily map out the whole house in my head. When that rug is pulled out from under you and, you really don't know what's what in the house.
You haven't seen the whole rug. To have it pulled out from under you. I can see that. Okay.
Think of, just a couple of weeks ago, we watched Don't Breathe, which does a fantastic job of, really mapping out spatially the house you're in.
So you become more disoriented once it changes because you already have an idea of how the house is laid out.
I think
get that.
I think narratively the house is used excellently.
Yeah.
And I think the foreshadowing of narrative elements like the knocks behind the walls are really well done.
And I want to make one final point while we're on the subject of like the scares and having an entity. And a counterpoint to what I actually brought up earlier about like there being like a Babadook, there being a creature, is the title of the film. And I think it's well worth bringing up that the definition of relic is an object surviving from an earlier time, especially one of historical or sentimental interest. And one of the greater fears conjured in this film is becoming an object. The urn on the wall is no longer a person. It is a thing. And as your mind degrades and you become just a hollow form, you become a house. A library burns down. You become an object again. And that actually void, that lack of a monster is, for me, really effective because it's that idea of becoming nothing or becoming non-sentient.
That's what I'm saying, though. Get rid of the monster and the house. Let the house do everything.
Oh, I
That's
see.
what I'm
So
saying.
More personality out of the emptiness.
More personality out of the emptiness. I think that visually the ghost or the specter is well handled, but I think that's why I was saying I think it distracts from the real monster, which is this house that's falling apart, that is consuming the people inside it and losing things. I think that like if you start thinking of memories as relics too, like she's losing everything. She
trying to eat the photographs.
Yes. Call them snack shots.
So like I would be shocked if the director Natalie Erica James didn't have someone in her life with dementia that she had like experienced, because so many of the moments are like so specific.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's really either she has a lot of personal experience from her own family or she did a shit ton of research for this, because it's really, really rare that you find a director that can so nakedly and truthfully get to the heart of what something is like. Because that is basically like what dealing with someone with dementia is like. And whenever you're writing a character with something like that, it's very, very difficult to ride the line of realism while also quickly portraying your point. So oftentimes films will just have an explosive scene where someone's like, I can't remember my wife, and then they're screaming and it doesn't like, and then it's kind of stupid. It's hammy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, You can have it be too slow of a build, and I never really landed. But I never got the sense in this film that she was fine. There was always like something's wrong, but it got those moments of clarity right. Like it got the emotional swings right. It was so efficient in how it told its story that it struck me in a way that other films don't. And I think that the efficiency of that writing and the quality of that writing is so good that a lot of these other concerns that we talk about, I think, are secondary to that main point. And that's the thing that's kind of interesting about a film of this level of quality, is that an indie film of this, because this is like what was the budget on this thing? It couldn't have been that big.
I have no idea, but not much for sure.
But a film like this, which I know it was supported by the Australian film grants or whatever, so this was like something that like a lot of the money must have came from various different nations have film grants to create art in the country or whatever. Anyways, the point I'm making is that the fear that I think humans have of their own death and their own end and their inability to kind of like grapple with that is very difficult to confront. So we usually come up with these like increasingly obscure ways to handle and deal with that fact. So the implicit underpinning of a lot of supernatural films, like The Conjuring or whatever, a lot of those Hollywood blockbusters, beat by beat scares, but the overall message is one of optimism, because the message ultimately is death is not the end. It's like you're watching The Exorcist or something like that, and isn't it terrible that this demon is assaulting the body of this poor girl? But the silver lining is that the priest was right. God loves you, and you're going to heaven.
Right.
And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in horror films, especially supernatural horror films. Is like, no matter what, it's like there is this life after death. Even something like The Ring is like she turned into a monster, blah, blah, blah. But there's now the possibility that there is a spirit, an everlasting spirit beyond what we have. The struggle of the proof of that spirit or whatever you believe is one of the great internal struggles that every person has when they're trying to like come to terms with their own mortality. Now, Relic is a film that has this monster, but it also completely doesn't have that sense of life after death. It does not have the sense of there is something grander, because there is always the level of metaphor.
The ghost is not a ghost.
Well, and that's the thing, is that there are two levels. There are two levels to Relic. There is the fact that, the things that you are seeing on the screen are clearly a metaphor, but they also could be happening on the screen. Like there could be a demon in this house, because they have this whole thing about how there's these monsters that take the bodies of people, and obviously it's a metaphor for dementia. But I mean, like when we're talking about like the real life world of people with quote demonic possessions, etc., like those could also just have been people with dementia.
Right.
Like in real life, that could have been the case. But maybe every person that has dementia in the real world is possessed by a demon. We don't fucking know. That could be the case. I don't think it's the case. I highly doubt that that's the case. But
sounds like burden of proof to me.
What I'm saying is that this is one of those rare few supernatural horror movies that doesn't have any kind of like theological underpinning. Mm-hmm. And as a result, it feels both more barren because you don't have this existing lexicon to pull from, but it also feels like infinitely more human. And that is what like really, really terrified me about the film, is that the monster in it is like something that doesn't feel like I'm not safe from this monster in this film.
Right.
Like uniquely amongst all the other monsters and all the other monster films, this specific one I'm not safe from, because it is essentially just dementia. And I think I sidetracked us from our previous point, which I apologize. But
oh no, you're good, man.
This movie strikes me in such a uniquely resonant way that I'm just trying to still grapple around, because that's the thing, is that like this film. Have you ever tried to like really visualize a needle in your brain? It like hurts your eyes to like visualize it. Trying to just like picture a needle coming towards your face, to think about it. There's something inside of you that's like, I don't want to do that. Or if you're scared of spiders, trying to visualize a spider right there in front of you and it's jumping at you. Like it's just difficult to do. In this film, it's so poignant in certain ways that I struggle to truly have a developed opinion on certain aspects of it, because when I do, my mind recoils. And I think that's truly unique and fascinating.
The mold on a visual level is, I think, so effective there. Like, we all should have, for survivalistic purposes, like, we should have that negative reaction to seeing mold on things. Like, when you open your fridge and you see like your leftovers have that like dark decay on them, you should feel your stomach churn. You're supposed to feel that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, it's representational of decay, which is scary on a instinctual level, because like that is the fate of all things. Like,
it's hard to pull off.
Rotting and degrading, and it's like that is going to happen to you no matter what.
Because so many films will use that for like gross out factor and leave it there. Like, and that's all that it means. But here it really does become something greater for that. And when you tie that metaphor into something so physically churning, like, I think, yeah, you really do get something that pops, that's really effective.
I think the return of the grandmother herself is a fantastic element of that metaphor too. I think it's one of the strongest points of the movie is her role in the film is kind of the mother and the daughter's memory of her as it decays, and the memory of her is less of her as they originally remembered her and more as the memories of her as she decays and her as she is less senile.
And as a reminder for what's in store for them,
yes,
too.
Yes.
That's what I like about like multi-generational stories like this. It's hard to not tie it to Hereditary in some ways. I think that would have been a suitably fitting title for this movie as well.
Yeah.
But like Sam, the granddaughter, feels this like duty toward taking care of her grandmother, because her mother sort of recoils from that because it scares her, because she sees herself much closer to that. She sees what's happening to her mother and is afraid that it will happen to her as well. And the idea of having to take on the burden of caring for somebody, you know, with dementia or Alzheimer's, it's like a daily reminder that like this could and very well be me soon.
Yeah.
I think one of the most horrifying parts of it too is the idea that the times you spend with a loved one where they're not completely there are so big and almost traumatic in your mind that they replace the memories that you have of them when they had all of their faculties.
Right.
And I think that is really emphasized, especially around the end.
At the very end.
Yeah.
I think let's get, we can go back and talk about other stuff too, but let's get into the end a little bit, because we're kind of naturally coming up on that. And I think that I would actually push back a little bit against the idea that this film is totally devoid of I don't know, hope at the end. Like, I think it is on its surface very bleak, but I think that there is something almost life-affirming in the acceptance that the family finds at the end. It's like, it's sad and it's horrible, but, you know, Emily Mortimer has been fighting against this idea that of like taking care of her mother because she's afraid that that's what she'll become. But at the end, by the end rather, she's reached a point where the pain and the horror and the fear is worth it because she still loves her mother.
The house and the grandmother lash back the most when there is the fear of her being placed in a home, when the denial is raised. trying to ignore the grandmother, put her somewhere else, that's when it lashes back. That's when the beast becomes an immediate threat. As soon as they accept it, the threat is still there, but it stops being immediate. The grandmother, once the daughter approaches her and just tries to care for her, at the very end, the grandmother becomes docile.
And we get that cutaway to the sticky note on the floor, because the grandma's leaving sticky notes all over the place to like remind herself. And at that moment, we get the sticky note that just says, you are loved.
Yeah,
exactly. I like it's
goosebumps.
It's so sad and so bleak, but that willingness to confront the horror in its face and to have that long agonizing scene of her like peeling off the skin of the grandmother to reveal this just like shriveled blackened husk, and to then like lay down beside her. It's like, yeah, you're exactly like you're saying, Ben. It's like what she has become is replacing their idea of what she was before, but still their sense of duty and love keeps them there. They don't run from it. They confront it at the end, and it, you know, in that regard, I think that there is a kind of light, a kind of hopefulness. Not the promise of heaven or afterlife or that things are going to get better, but that love can win in the end, kind of.
Yes. If I could talk once again about like personal experience in tandem with this film, how like growing up with my grandfather sort of put like this fear of God, you know, in me, of this one day potentially being me. Because, you know, like Alzheimer's is known to skip generations. I take after my grandfather a lot, like genetically. So like there's a lot of concern, and it's always been like a fear that is sort of gnawed at my, you know, the back of my neck. And growing up, the way I was able to come to terms with that was acceptance and just recognizing my timeline might be more limited. I might not get as long. Maybe I do. Maybe the dice, you know, like roll well for me. I don't know. But I also know that there's a chance that, you know, the dice will just come up poorly. And my acknowledgement of that, my acceptance of that, allows me to just say, I will make what time I have valuable. And that's why, like, I'm so driven for my work. I think it's also like a large component of things like the Bushido Code, where you're supposed to meditate on your death, you know, for like 15 minutes every day. There's something to that acceptance of death that removes the fear of it and just allows you to say, okay, when it comes, and I will just be my best self until that day, and that will be fine. And this film like does such a good job of covering that. So even though the light casting that shadow, the God behind the demon, you know, that must also exist, is not as present, is not as clear at the end, it is still there. There is, yeah, that idea of like acceptance and love, like, can still at the very least mitigate the horror.
Yeah, but it doesn't. I agree with you, but I don't think that the film hits you over the head with it. Like, it's not.
Oh yeah, I agree.
A ray of light doesn't descend. Right.
Thank God. Thank God for it.
Here's how this movie would work if it was a worse movie. That window with the mold would shatter and light would shine through. And then
God, you're so right.
Grandma,
oh my God.
The black parts of the grandma would begin to heal, and she would be better. And then, you know, they would all go out with
believe
the photo
in fairies.
album, and they would plant a tree to represent their new life. And then they would take piece of the photo album, and then you'd have to have something that would make the grandma more of a victim. Like, you'd have to find out that her husband was abusive or something, and that now she's free from that, and she would bury the book of pictures and the memories to therefore symbolize her starting of a new life. But no, you don't get that.
And the granddaughter would get a boyfriend.
Yeah. No, she would come out as gay because this is 2020, and everyone would be okay with that, and then old grandma wouldn't have any weird opinions about it. She would say something about along the lines of like, you know, well, I fought for civil rights, and this is what you get to, and like it would just be like, that would be how this movie would work if it was part of the Conjuring franchise.
For sure.
And I love that they don't do that. What instead you get is like, this is what you get. You get, if you are lucky, to be with someone as they die, and if you are the dying person, if you are lucky, then you get to have your loved ones there to care for you as you crumble into nothingness.
Yes.
And it's like, and that's it. And that's the credits. in real life, you know.
For sure.
And then of course we get the last shot of the movie, which is the daughter reaching towards her mother's back because there's a piece of black. Oh, and to be, for everyone at home listening, the decay on the physical body is visible on the grandmother before she becomes a cripple demon, whatever those, like the thing at the end, and so she sees like a spot of blackness on her mother's back that is to imply that her mother also is going to get dementia, and even if she doesn't get dementia, we're all gonna lose our faculties and die someday.
Right. Yar, she has the black spot, maybe.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, yeah, there's definitely that idea, that theme of, this being something passed down through families. The cabin that used to be on the property where, they took the stained glass window from, they mentioned that like her great grandfather lived there and that he, lost his mind or something. And we keep seeing that in her nightmares, which, gotta say again, like those dream sequences are very, very well done.
Chef kiss. Yeah. Chef kiss.
I'm very wary of dream sequences in horror movies. We've talked about that a lot, but I think just as like being effective horror set pieces, these are quite well done. But like, yeah, seeing the moldering and rotting but still living corpse of her great grandfather in these dreams and like waking up, it's like that's like, yeah, this is coming for you. And I think that there's something really powerful in that scene of the granddaughter touching that black spot on her mother too, because I think it's also her realizing that, yeah, not only is this going to come for her mother, but it'll probably come for her too. It's right. Like it's coming, that they're all lying down next to each other at the end, and it's like, yeah, this is gonna come down the line. It's inescapable. I'm so glad they did not do any of what you described, Ted. Like, holy fuck, that would be so bad.
And once again, to call back to the Babadook too, like I think that that film does a great job of that as well. Like in the moral of the Babadook, and I think in the Babadook it does feel a little bit more like a ray of sunshine. It is like shot very warmly at the end, where like she gives it a bowl of milk, and it's
she gives it a bowl of worms.
Oh yeah,
just to feed it with decay.
Yeah.
But I mean, even in the Babadook, it ends with her saying, when the son asks about it, she says it's quiet today. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, today the trauma and the depression and stuff, today it's not quiet, but that doesn't mean it'll be quiet tomorrow,
Yeah, I don't think the Babadook would have been as big of a demon if the kid wasn't such a piece of shit, though. It definitely had something to do with it.
That's
for sure. I mean, yeah, we talked about that too.
I don't want to sidetrack into a discussion of the Babadook. I'm not a huge fan of the Babadook because that kid is so fucking annoying. Like, I would have murdered that kid so fast. Like, if that kid, like, if I was looking after someone's kid and they were like, I dressed up like a wizard and I shot you with a pencil crossbow, I'd be like, all right, well, no one's ever finding you again. Like, that's just sorry.
To go back to your point, like, and we did do an episode on the Babadook a while ago, but don't you think that that's intentional in the Babadook?
I definitely think it's intentional. I'm not saying it's a bad film. There's a big difference. What I'm saying is that this is an example of, on the flip side, that child annoyed me as a person, which got in the way of my enjoyment of the film. But I would never give it less of a score or a worse rating because of the kid,
Sure. I think that the kid is supposed to be annoying. She's so hung up on the death of her husband and what she lost, and that the child that came out of it, it's so much of the movie is her struggling to not blame the kid for the death of her husband. Mm-hmm. So to paint him as like a really problematic, like devil child almost, it's like she has to. Yeah. She has to cope with that, just like she has to cope with everything else. And, at the end, with like the Babadook's quiet that day, and the kid is good. He's good that day, but he might not be the next day.
And this is a good juxtaposition to the Relic. To Relic, not the Relic. I don't want to get people confused once again with the 1997 monster flick. But Babadook, there's a point about halfway through the movie where the kid becomes the good guy. not halfway, probably like 70% through the movie. Before that, the kid's like a terrorist. Like he's just like actively plotting the downfall of the West. And then as soon as the demon starts being like demony and stuff and takes over his mom, there's this like one scene where he's like, "Mommy, I just love you so much," and he becomes like a little cutesy kid. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, this kid was a terrorist 12 seconds ago, and now we're supposed to sympathize with him. The switch has flipped real fast in going from this kid's a piece of shit to, like, now it's a magical adventure where he's going to use slingshots to fight the demon. I'm like, now it's like Home Alone. And then at the end, he's just like a cute kid. And I'm like,
oh, sorry.
Well, like, okay, first off, I would have paid like real cash dollars if there was a scene in that movie where the mom just like double foot drop kicks the kid in the chest. Like, I would have loved that so much. He like flies against a wall, like, ugh, and then like the crossbow, like, doing, like, you can do it Looney Tunes like style
child
too.
abuse would have really made the mom more relatable.
Oh my god,
totally...
so much more relatable. Anyways, that is like a shift that happens really, really starkly in the Babadook, and that I think is a sign of the director. I can't remember the director of the Babadook.
Jennifer Kent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was also her first movie. And I think that was more of a sign of her kind of amateurishness, is that transition from him being an absolute nightmare to this good, cutesy, wholesome angel child was too stark. And I think that was like an amateurish. Whereas in Relic, what you're talking about is like the shift from things being not Silent House on Haunted Hill to Silent House on Haunted Hill
of Leaves.
Yeah, that shift was, I think, more. First off, the starkness of that shift is less unwelcome, and it's also less drastic because there are things that hint at it before. Like, nowhere before in the movie of the Babadook were you ever like, this kid's okay. It was always, he's a terrorist. Whereas in this movie, you're like, things aren't okay. There seems to be something worse going on. And then when you uncover that, you're like, oh. And I think that was really symbolic of the daughter learning more about the dementia, because at the beginning of the movie, she's like, grandma's fine, which is very, very common for younger people to just deny that there's anything bad going on.
She just forgets things. That's what she keeps saying.
And then she discovers it firsthand when the grandmother is like, you're stealing from me. And she's like, Jesus, fuck, no. And then she kind of sees she's the one that discovers the depths of like what's happening and is like, oh my God, like this is so tragic and terrifying. And it like, and you know, when the shifting of the walls is also a metaphor for her own shifting perspective, trying to recontextualize her grandmother, given these things that she's seen, the potentially crushing like weight of like, how do I rectify that the person that I love is also the person that has become this. So many layers to it. It's so wonderfully deep, and I love that about it. And I feel that there's the layer of a movie that you have to justify in your brain, and that's like the smartness stuff, the smarty level, the higher cognitive level of a film. That, you know, a lot of it is basically people sitting on podcasts and, you know, jerking off to the sounds of their own voice, which is, you know, apparently what all podcasts are.
I mean,
yeah, that's
absolutely.
all we're doing.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's all we're doing. But and then there's the level of gut reaction. And I will say is that the gut reaction that I felt through the entirety of Relic was a very satisfying, deep sickness and dread, which is what I think the film was going for. Whereas in the Babadook, I just wanted to 2-foot drop kick a child.
Well, as a bisexual, I have to defend my gay horror icon, the Babadook, and just
how is the Babadook gay?
Oh, it's not. That's why it's so funny. To further this tangent real quick, there was an accident in the Netflix algorithm, and it started trending under LGBT movies, and so the gay community just adopted it,
just co-opted.
So
the Babadook.
Soon after, during Pride events, people were dressing as the Babadook during like Pride and such, and it's great, and I love it.
Now the Babadook
it has nothing to do with queerness or the LGBT community, and I think that makes it even better that it's been adopted into that. But anyway,
they also did the same thing with Pennywise with the recent It movies.
Oh, did they?
Well, the gay community did, and they just
Excellent.
said that the Pennywise is the Babadook's boyfriend now.
Oh, I
So,
love that.
yeah.
I ship it. I ship it. So, anyway, to defend that real quick, and why I actually see the kids' sudden shift as by design, and I might have mentioned this on the podcast. I don't remember. It was a while back. Is I've seen that in kids too. Like that felt very real to me. Like that sudden shift. Kids are still learning who they are, and they do that. Like they'll turn on the waterworks, and it is a very manipulative tool, that sudden change of personality, and they do that. So I'll actually say, like, I didn't see that as a sign of amateurism, though I can perceive the other side. I do dig that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And I'm not, and like I said, I'm not trying to sit here and say like The Babadook is a bad movie. I would just say that No. And I actually have been guilty of that in the past, just to be an edgelord. Like when I was younger, I can't remember when The Babadook came out. When it came out, I was like, this movie sucks, because I was trying to be an edgelord, but I've since grown out of that.
Well, we all have to grow and learn.
Well, Relic.
I think I've covered all of my points. Do you guys have any other things you want to hit before we rate?
I thought the sound design was pretty good.
Oh yeah, the creaking
overall.
house.
Yeah.
I will say this: Relic has a very high chance of being overlooked because of the pandemic and because no one wants to watch depressing movies right now, and also there's no theaters, so it's very hard to get things to, and there's no word of mouth because no one can talk to each other anymore in person.
And it's not an American film too.
Yeah, it's not an American film. Well, I mean, neither was The Babadook, and that made its rounds. But I will say, Relic there's a very, very high chance that this one will go ironically forgotten. At the same time, that's a great tragedy, because I think that I genuinely believe that any fan of filmmaking as an art form, and any fan of horror as a medium, like really inundated in horror as a medium, they need to watch this movie, even if it's not their type of movie, because there's certain films that will widen the breadth of what the genre can do. And I think that Relic is intentionally designed enough and metaphoric enough while still being grounded and real enough to be a new kind of benchmark for artsy horror. And you might not like artsy horror. I mean, I'm trying to say everyone has to like the types of films that I like. But I do think that if you're going to be an aficionado of a genre, you have to be aware of the various different the perimeters of the genre, what the frontiers of the genre, and what films are pushing those frontiers further.
It
like
is a gateway drug. Like this film, you're absolutely right. Like I think this film is an excellent gateway drug into more academic horror.
Yeah, well, and I think that it's not even just like a gateway drug into more academic horror. It's a solid piece of academic horror that also people that aren't super into academic horror can still grasp.
Oh yeah.
It's accessible, and it's accessible, but like definitely outside of the realm of like Hollywood horror.
And
Best
I
of both
think having a
worlds.
tight 88-minute runtime definitely helps with that,
Oh yeah, we didn't even mention the runtime, because like the thing is that a movie like this done by a film student would be 6 hours long, like seriously, and it would feature so many shots of the mother and daughter eating oatmeal at breakfast, and then like not saying anything until the mother says something like, "So what are you?" And then the daughter just goes, "Ah," and then leaves. And then it's like, wasn't that so real? Didn't you just feel that? And it's like the only reason that scene's in the movie is because like the daughter, like the real life filmmaker, had to like call her mom to ask for money. And like the mom asked how she's doing, and she's like, "I'm doing fine, like always, Mom." Well, Mom's like, "Whatever happened to that boyfriend?" She's like, "I came out to you like 3 months ago." She's like, "I know, I was just hoping that." And then she puts it all in the movie. All of that goes right in the movie, word for word. And that's how like an amateur filmmaker tends to make this kind of movie. And then as you get older and you like want money, you stop having those emotions and you start making Transformers. And this is like an excellent, fantastic little snapshot into a young filmmaker who still has that fire and the passion, but is also uniquely rawly talented. And I think it's fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah.
A great example of that is how Sam inherently wants to help look after the grandmother. You know,
Yeah.
she's the young one, and she is unafraid of it. And so often you get that
She's
young
the
people,
farthest removed from it.
right? And how
Yeah,
stereotypical is it for like the young person to be scared of the old, to be scared of death, and she's not, and
scared
it's
of
so
old
much
people.
more real for it.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. Ted, I think that you have summarized the film and your thoughts on it really well. Why don't you give us our first rating? What would you rate
Yeah.
Relic out of 5?
Pods also on the
Yes.
podcast. We do pods.
We do pods, although I'm the only one who really adheres to that because y'all do stars constantly or whatever. Yeah,
How many
just
so it's the same. Well, we in Dread Central we used to do knives, so it was like 5 knives
nice.
out of 5 or whatever, or how many knives out of 5. So it's out of 5.
yeah,
And halves are fine.
halves are fine. Yeah.
For all the reasons that I have enumerated in this podcast, I would give this. Okay, I will probably never watch this movie again because it depressed the fuck out of me. Same with like a game like The Last of Us 2. I will probably never play The Last of Us 2 again. Loved it. Think it's a landmark title. Will probably never play it again. So if I'm talking about my like personal feelings on this film, I'm probably never going to watch this again. That being said, I would still 100% give it a 5 out of 5 because this is a film that I think is, if you are going to be a horror scholar, a person that studies horror, a horror hyper fan, whatever, that is how I'm judging this film. Is like anyone that's a horror hyper fan absolutely has to watch this movie. Anyone that's like a horror scholar has to watch this movie. Anyone that's interested in the frontiers of filmmaking has to watch this movie. I think it's brilliant and it's beautiful, and it's also, if I ever watch this movie again, I have to love the person that's asking me to watch it so fucking much. and like seriously, like this is like, or someone has to have a gun to my head. But I still love the film, and I would give it a 5 out of 5. That's my opinion.
All right, strong 5 out of 5. Ben, what about you?
Sure. I had some issues with some of the pacing in the first act in regards to the escalation. But the one thing I'll say about that is, I think an 88-minute runtime really lessens that issue overall. And I think the metaphor and the ideas are really interesting and really profound and impactful. I think a lot of the things with dementia are really hit home, and they're very emotional. Overall, I'm going to give this a 3.5 out of 5. I think it's definitely worth checking out.
Cleve?
Personally, I found no flaws, and this film appealed to everything I could have asked for. Going off of the trailer, I was expecting a classy, haunting ghost film, and what I got was so much more. It's an easy 5 from me.
All right, and I will round us out. I think this movie does a lot of things extremely well. I'm really excited to see the way that this young filmmaker's career progresses. I think she's definitely one to look out for. A lot of good female directors out of Australia doing horror these days, so I'm well on board with that. I think that the trailer doesn't quite represent this movie in
I think in a good way, though. Like it presents it as a subversion.
Sure. I think that like I mentioned early in the show, I think that it struggles a little bit to look beyond its metaphor. I think it's very literal, and as a like haunting story is maybe ineffective, but as a very bleak and sad and honest portrait of a family struggling with a loved one having dementia, it is extremely powerful. I definitely think this is one to check out as well, especially considering the weird mismatch of 2020 horror films, stuff that was supposed to come out and didn't, stuff that we didn't even know about was coming and just sort of dropped on VOD. This is one to watch. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. So that will give Relic between us an average of 4.4 out of 5 pods. So definitely check it out. Next week, I believe it is Cleveland's pick for what we're going to be talking about. Have you decided what that's going to be, Cleve?
Yeah, so I talked to you guys about potentially watching Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And I watched the trailer for it after y'all left last night and decided that I would rather watch Young Frankenstein.
Oh,
Okay.
Again. So how would y'all feel about Young Frankenstein?
okay.
It's a horror comedy.
Yeah, for sure. I
need
haven't seen
something
it in
upbeat.
forever. Yeah, I was fully expecting you to make us watch Abbott and Costello, and I was expecting to have a really bad time the next episode. So
I'm still holding that one in my back pocket. Don't think it's totally gone. And same with Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. One day
You're
I'm gonna
waiting
pull that one
for
out.
one of us to pick a bad
Just get ready.
title.
Oh,
yeah,
this will be
you're waiting for revenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will get back at you for Greasy Strangler. It will happen.
Greasy Strangler.
That's a movie.
It is.
It is a movie, and
Cleveland's got some really strong opinions on that.
I do, and they're on that episode that we did for reviewing it. And I also, as strong as my opinions are on that film, I think it's one of our best podcast episodes.
I would agree. If you haven't listened to that, go listen to it, and come back next week for our review of Young Frankenstein. We haven't done a horror comedy in a little bit.
What We Do in the Shadows wasn't too long.
Wasn't too long ago. It's hard to keep track of time during quarantine.
true.
Everything all blends into one.
The walls are closing in.
Exactly. But anyway, if you like the show, be sure to go on to Apple Podcasts and hit those 5 stars, leave a nice review, share an episode with your friends and family. You can follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod and check out our Letterboxd page at letterboxd.com/PodPeoplePod, where you'll find a list of all the films we've talked about on the show with our average ratings and links to those episodes. I'm on Twitter at Deep State Ozzy.
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Sheets.
And I'm occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studio as we further progress on It Stares Back, our early access horror RTS game that is spooky and fun. I can also be found on ArtStation. If you search Cleveland Mosier, check out my super fun, creepy paintings. And also, Ted, if it's okay for me to say too, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
you can see my work where I've collaborated with Ted on the DreadX Collection 2. So look out for my spooky skeletons that I painted in that awesome game, and it really does look awesome. I'm super excited to play it.
Yes, well, on that subject, Ted, we have been so happy to have you joining us, so let's take a minute. You plug whatever you would like. Tell us where people can find you and what they should be looking out for.
Yeah, I don't really tweet personally. I have way too hot of takes for that. I don't think the internet's ready for all my opinions yet. But
I feel that.
I have a company Twitter, which I sometimes have mild versions of my horrible thoughts on. It's going to be at DreadXP. So, and then the game is coming out, DreadX Collection Volume 2. It's just DreadX Collection 2. Shit, we dropped the volume. Just DreadX Collection 2. It is the sequel to the DreadX Collection, hence the 2. And you can already find the DreadX Collection on Steam. By the time this comes out, you'll probably be able to find DreadX Collection 2 as well. It's coming out August 21st. So, right around the corner, and everyone will be able to get their hands on it.
Oh, you'll have that date certain?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I need to re-edit that
like,
announcement.
This might be
yeah.
coming out right around that same time, so
that's perfect.
That's pretty perfect.
Excellent.
And this one's really, really awesome. The first one was 10 games made in 7 days. This one's 12 games made in 10 days. And you'd think that those extra 3 days, wouldn't make that much of a difference. But oh my gosh, the games coming out this time are so good. I'm so excited for people to be able to see it and get their hands on it and experience what we have in store for you guys. So
It's so substantial. It's amazing. Yeah, it's incredible.
It's really kind of incredible what we've managed to put together in such a small period of time. So
I just checked my calendar, and this episode will be dropping the day before the DreadX 2.
Nice.
So if you're listening to this, the game might already be out, so definitely go check it out. And I think that will do it for us this week. Ted, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really excellent discussion of Relic, and we'd love to have you back sometime.
no problem, guys. Yeah, just let me know. I always love talking about movies.
We do need a sponsor. for the podcast.
Well, hurry up. This is a long episode.
Yes. This episode was brought to you by Gentle Rolling Hill Mills, everyone's favorite cereal distributor, and their new line of cereal, Moldy-O's. Get your Moldy-O's today, and embrace the decay.
They'll turn you into a husk. All right, thanks everybody for listening. Come back and join us next week for something completely different and much less dour. Goodbye.